Do you think you know Iran? You think it is a country defined by threat and tension because that is the only version you have been given. Have you ever tried imagining that? How did a city built on barren limestone hills, with no river, no harbor, and no natural resources, become the most contested piece of land in the entire history of human civilization? Also, have you ever wondered why the world's oldest written declaration of human rights was not born in Athens or Rome, but pressed into a clay cylinder by a Persian king in 500? Forget the headlines. Iran is not the country you were handed. It is a civilization that kept a sacred flame burning for 15 centuries, carved homes into volcanic stone, and rebuilt cities from rubble. Because here, collapse has never meant the end. This is unreal Iran. The Strait of Hormuz narrows to approximately 21 miles at its most constricted point, and within this channel, through which Hormuz Island sits 5 miles, measuring barely 8 miles across, its low profile visible from Bandar Abbas as a dark smudge against water that shifts between turquoise and deep green. Nothing about that silhouette prepares the arriving visitor for what the island actually is: a salt dome thrust upward through the sea floor over millions of years, carrying from depth a concentration of 70 distinct mineral types compressed into a landmass. The red beaches announce this reality immediately, a color so saturated that the first encounter produces a perceptual delay before the mind accepts. Iron oxide at a concentration has incorporated the soil into domestic life for centuries. The red earth, called golak, is ground into a pigment pressed into flatbreads with oil and aromatic herbs, painted onto faces for celebrations. The geology beneath their feet treated as a pantry rather than a speck. In the Rainbow Valley, mineral striations run in horizontal and deposits of mica and crystal within the beach. Sand scatter light at multiple wavelengths simultaneously, producing the consistent perceptual report of walking across a surface, generating its own illumination from within. The same geography that creates this beauty creates vulnerability. The strait's strategic value makes Hormuz one of the most militarily monitored pieces of land on Earth, and the fishing communities sustaining the island's economy operate within marine ecosystems, measurably stressed by a Persian Gulf, warming faster than almost any comparable body of water. The Iranian Central Plateau arrives at Isfahan as a wide, dust-hazed plain at approximately 250 feet elevation, enclosed by mountain ridges that turn violet at dusk. The Naqsh Jahan Square, measuring nearly 600 feet in length, one of the largest enclosed public spaces on Earth, holds morning as light strikes the Shah Mosque's eastern facade. Its tilework achieves a cobalt so layered across centuries of geometric repetition that the surface appears to generate illumination rather than reflect it. Beneath the main dome, a single hand clap returns precisely 7 times the 7 heavens of Islamic cosmology. Engineered into geometry with 17th century mathematics, theology expressed as measurable physics. 15 minutes north, in the Armenian Christian quarter of Jolfa, the Vank Cathedral presents from outside the unmistakable silhouette of an Iranian Islamic structure tiled dome, pointed arches, a campanile proportioned like a minaret, then opens inside to reveal 17th century Armenian frescoes covering every wall. The expulsion from Eden, The martyrdom of early Christians, rendered in a tradition entirely distinct from the surrounding Islamic architecture. This was not confusion. It was Shah Abbas's deliberate policy granting Isfahan's Armenian silk-weaving community full religious autonomy in exchange for producing a neighborhood where two devotional traditions built their most sacred structures within walking distance of each other and held that arrangement intact across 4 centuries. The Zayandeh River, which once defined Isfahan's identity and fed the Persian gardens, has run dry for extended periods in recent decades. The bridges and the Isfahanis, who gather on their promenades in the evenings, do so above a riverbed that memory insists. The Zagros Mountains enclose Shiraz at approximately 200 feet in a valley that functions as a microclimate trap, holding moisture, moderating temperature, producing growing conditions so anomalous within the surrounding semi-arid plateau that the city has sustained rose cultivation for over 1,000 years. On early summer mornings, the fragrance arrives before any visual detail of the settlement itself, carried on air, still cool enough to hold scent, rather than simply transmit heat. The limestone ridges holding this valley catch the first light of sunrise, while the city below remains in shadow. And in that interval of differential illumination, Shiraz presents itself as a place that exists inside a deliberate exception. Within that exception, the Nasir al-Mulk Mosque resolves the city's character most precisely. Built in the 1880s with a stained glass facade facing east, it produces each morning a phenomenon where the prayer hall floor becomes a surface in continuous motion, colored light shifting across Persian carpets as the earth rotates. The architecture, transformed by solar geometry into devotional space, and daily proof that beauty achieved through mathematical precision is indistinguishable from grace. Across the city, at the tomb of the 14th century poet Hafez, Iranians of every generation arrive carrying unanswerable departure, uncertain futures, and open the collected poems at random, treating the lines they find as direct response from a voice that stopped speaking in 1390 CE and has not, in the living theology of this practice, stopped listening since. The city's contemporary tension is quieter. The same mild climate that sustained Shiraz's rose gardens and its poets now attracts a volume of tourism that the valley's intimate wind-scoured plateau, where the land offers almost nothing, no river, at an angle so direct that exposed rock surfaces reach temperatures, the air is thin, and the figures who faced the afternoon sun for 25 centuries are beginning. The Dasht-e presses from the north, the Dasht-e-Lut from the east, and Yazd sits at their convergence as though placed deliberately at the point of maximum inhospitability, receiving fewer than 2 inches of rain annually, enduring summers exceeding 115 degrees Fahrenheit, absorbing winds that carry fine mineral dust from salt. The city does not fight this environment. Its mud brick walls are the color of the desert because they are made of the desert, and the Badger wind towers rising above its roof lines represent 14 centuries of accumulated intelligence about how to make a hostile climate useful. Passive atmospheric engines that capture, accelerate them through narrowing shafts, and deliver air up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Cooler, no energy, no maintenance beyond clearing dust from intake vents. Below those towers, Families who have lived in Yazd for generations describe the sound of wind entering the shaft at night as something between ventilation and conversation. The desert, after centuries of negotiation, finally agreeing to cooperate. At the Atash Berum fire temple, a flame has burned without tended across 80 generations by the same priestly families who understand their obligation as literal maintenance of a continuity that predates Islam and has survived every political transformation since. Yazd is the only city on earth where this ancient flame and the mosque's call to prayer coexist within the same neighborhood. Two traditions about the divine and agreed across 14 centuries that the agreement to share mattered more than the conclusions themselves. What this equilibrium costs, as younger Zoroastrian generations leave for Tehran and beyond, is a question the fire temple answers only with continued burning. Tehran announces itself from the south as a brown-gray density pressed against the Alborz Range Mountains, rising to over 18,000, their snowline visible on clear days as a white horizontal stripe drawn across the upper atmosphere, clean and entirely indifferent to what accumulates below. The city spreads across the mountain's southern slope at an elevation differential 000 feet between its wealthiest northern districts and its most industrial southern zones. A topographic stratification so precise in its correspondence to economic geography that altitude here functions simultaneously as meteorological measurement and social address. Below the visible city, 5 identified fault lines converge beneath the urban fabric. Seismological assessments describe a magnitude 7 earthquake directly beneath a metropolitan area of 15 million, as not a matter of... And the older concrete structures covering much of the urban area represent a vulnerability that official reports have documented for decades without generating adequate structural response. Inside the Golestan Palace, the Hall of Mirrors demonstrates what this civilization produced when given time and patronage. Qajar craftspeople shattered mirrors into millions of angular fragments and set each piece individually into plaster, angled to catch light from every direction simultaneously. A single candle introduced to this room multiplies across millions of surfaces until the walls dissolve into sourceless luminosity. The theological conviction that divine light does not concentrate in single points across every willing surface, made physically inhabitable. Outside the palace gates, the city lives within the practical distance between that vision and the arithmetic of sanctions, traffic, and daily endurance, a distance that Tehranis have refined across generations into a specific form of persistence. Mount Sahand spreads across the horizon, southeast of Tabriz, as a shield volcano of such horizontal mass that it reads less like a mountain and more like elevated terrain that forgot to stop. Its last major eruption occurred approximately 10,000 years ago, depositing volcanic ash across surrounding valleys that compressed over millennia into ignimbrite soft, the thermally stable rock that erodes under wind and rain into conical formations, rising 15 to 40 feet from valley floors in clusters of irregular geometry. In a valley approximately 35 miles south of Tabriz at roughly 900 feet elevation, the village of Kandavan has existed inside these formations for approximately 700 years, not beside the volcanic cones, but within them, human settlement and geological formation across centuries of continuous occupation. The same thing. The ignimbrite maintains interior temperatures regardless of external conditions, natural insulation performing what modern building science achieves through synthetic layers. Families cook, sleep, and raise children in chambers carved niches, wooden doors fitted into widened openings, external stone staircases built directly onto cone surfaces. Smoke exits through channels cut into the peak. Sheep graze below. What separates Kandavan from Cappadocia, the Turkish cave landscape, receiving incomparably greater international attention, is the fact that no one here ever left. Cappadocia's dwellings were abandoned and converted into boutique hotels. Kandavan's residents continued. The Mongol-era emergency that originally drove people into the rock transformed, across 7 centuries, into simply the way life is organized. The contemporary pressure is economic rather than geological. Younger generations weighing the thermal stability of volcanic rock against the professional opportunities available 35 miles down. The Lut Desert occupies southeastern Iran as one of the hottest surfaces on Earth. Satellite measurements have recorded ground temperatures here exceeding 159 degrees Fahrenheit, and against its western edge, in Kerman province, Agh-e-Bam rises from the valley floor in walls so uniformly the color of surrounding terrain that the eye initially misreads it as topography rather than architecture. Every brick was made from the same material the desert provided without cost. Compressed earth mixed with straw, dried in the same heat that made the building necessary, a technology so perfectly circular that the desert both created the pressure beneath those walls. The Qanat network made the city real hand, following the water table's gradient from mountain to plain through tunnels that maintained precise downhill angles without mechanical assistance, delivering water from sources up to 25 miles distant by gravity alone. The Qanat embodies a single insight. The desert does not lack water, but stores it underground, beyond evaporation's reach. And the correct human response is to descend, through labor measured across generations, to where it already exists. This system sustained a Silk Road city of 13,000 people across 20 centuries. On the 26th of December, 2003, an earthquake struck directly beneath the sleeping city, and within 26 seconds collapsed 20 centuries of construction onto the people inside it, killing 26,000. Reconstruction has continued for over 2 decades. Original bricks recovered from rubble, cleaned, catalogued, returned to approximate positions. The Qanat channels restored alongside the walls they once sustained. The city is being reassembled from its own remains, which is, across every scale of its history, precisely what BAM has always done. The Dasht-e-Kavir meets the southern foothills of Iran's central mountains at Kashan, in a landscape of stark transition salt, dead ochre-gray hillsides, without any intermediate softness. The city appears from the approach road as an extension of this terrain. Mud brick perimeter walls, the color of surrounding earth, roof lines broken only by the occasional badger tower, nothing in the exterior announcing what it contains.